Okay, everyone, let's start to quiet down and get started for today's seminar. So my name is Willie Fetzer. I'm one of the researchers up here at the field station. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce Sara Germain, a professor in the Department of Botany, and Tucker Furniss, a professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management. And as one half of a husband and wife team who studies aquatic ecosystems, it's really exciting for me to see our terrestrial counterparts, Tucker and Sara, give their presentation. Together, they look at forest dynamics ranging from how individual tree mortality up to entire forest change. And they do this at very fine scales, counting tree rings on individual trees to figure out how old they were when they died, all the way up to using remote sensing and satellite imageries to check how does this then pattern emerge at broader scale. So without further ado, or whatever, Tucker and Sara.
Thank you, Robert. All right, thank you, everybody. Let me see if I can figure this out. That guy? Oh, all right. Everyone hear me okay? Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful turnout. Tucker and I are just thrilled to be talking with you today about our very favorite thing, trees. And so in this photo, you can see a crew of 13 of our grad students and forest technicians who are currently, as we speak, up in the backcountry installing some of the permanent plots that we'll be talking about today. And so Tucker and I are both assistant professors at the University of Wyoming, and starting last year, we have spent all summer living and working here in the park out of the campground to install these permanent plots. So if it looks like we've been living out of a tent for the past 2 months, that's because we have been.
Nice.
It's the best way to get to know the trees. So to start off, I just want to get us all on the same page about what is a forest. Now, I think most people would agree that these two images show forests, right? We have a bunch of trees, most of them are alive, and they go on as far as the eye can see. So yeah, these are forests. But what about these? And yes, this is kind of a trick question because of course it depends, right? Is a single tree a forest? Is a clump of trees a forest? Well, so far what I'm beginning to learn is it really depends on who you ask. If you ask a great horned owl, this one tree is a critical nesting site in a sea of sagebrush or prairie ecosystem. It could also be an important place for a hawk to perch and hunt. And this one tree might be the seed source that creates the forest in the future. So maybe it's not a forest now, but it still has these really important ecosystem functions that trees only can provide. So what about the cluster of trees? You might see where I'm going here. So the cluster of trees is also really important to this ecosystem. It's the difference between this, let's see if I can find my pointer, this really rocky kind of plantless, lifeless substrate that has been left behind after a glacier recedes, to soil that plants can grow in. That's all because of this cluster of trees leaving plant litter, leaf debris, and fine root turnover that allows for this soil development and plants to grow. So again, a critical part of the ecosystem, and really that cluster of trees is allowing for a forest to be there in the future. So what Tucker and I are really going to be talking about today is this idea that forests are multi-scale ecological phenomena, all the way from a single tree out on the prairie to a landscape like what you see here, full of trees as far as the eye can see. And what we're beginning to learn is that we can really only gain a full understanding of forest health and functioning when we look at each of those different scales at the same time. So in today's talk, we're going to have 3 main sections. First, I want to just introduce you a little bit to the forests here in Grand Teton, which are some of the most beautiful forests I have ever worked in. And I hope that you have all had little experiences here and there hiking through them as well. Then we're going to introduce you to the Grand Teton Forest Dynamics Plot Network, which is the permanent research program that Tucker and I are beginning here in the park. And finally, we're going to give a bunch of snapshots snippets of current work that we are doing in the forests of Grand Teton and what we're learning so far. So to begin, I want to introduce you to kind of 4 categories of forests that each have really important ecosystem services, wildlife habitat benefits, and threats as well. So let's begin first with riparian forests. These are the forests that grow along rivers. For example, the Snake River and the Gros Ventre River here in the park. And these are often dominated by cottonwood trees, like you see here, in addition to willows, alders, and other hardwood deciduous species that lose their leaves in the winter. So these riparian forests are really important corridors of connectivity that allow migrating species to have cover and food sources, no matter where they are, whether it's in the park, on private land, or in the Forest Service or BLM land. These riparian corridors are often intact, and they're one of the few types of habitat connectivity that remain. And so what we see in terms of their ecosystem services is that these cottonwood trees specifically really help stabilize the stream bank. And what that means is there is less erosion. The stream bank is not just falling into the water and getting it all dirty. So that means cleaner water for us downstream. It also means cleaner water for the fish and other inhabitants of those streams and rivers. So water uptake by the trees while they're conducting photosynthesis can be immense. And this water uptake can prevent floods, in addition to all of the leaf debris and branches on the ground that can reduce water runoff if there is a large rainfall event. So having these trees along the river is a really important way to reduce large floods if we do have large precipitation events. On the wildlife side of things, if you're a birder, you may notice that riparian corridors are a really fun place to see a lot of unique birds, from osprey, heron, even pelicans here in the park. And these trees are really important nesting sites for them. In addition to all of the different kind of river-specific wildlife that we see as well, beavers need these trees to create their lodges, in addition to bats who feed on insects that are often themselves feeding on the trees. So they really form the center of these riparian ecosystems. The primary threats that I wanted to mention for riparian habitats are, number one, overgrazing. So one of the things I mean by this are simply, if the herbivore populations are too big, we might see them eating more willows or more young cottonwood saplings than those forests are really adapted to handle. And the kind of classic story of this is up in Yellowstone, right? When the wolves were reintroduced, we've seen those elk and deer populations go down, and as a consequence, these riparian habitats have become healthier. So by kind of controlling the herbivore population, that's one way that we can help these riparian forests to thrive. But there's also all kinds of things. Invasive plants, simply changing hydrology as the river moves back and forth. And I wanted to call everyone's attention to this very beautiful moth, the white satin moth, which is an invasive insect that is luckily not in Grand Teton yet, but it has been observed in southern Wyoming. So if you ever see it in the area, make sure to let somebody here in the park know, because early detection is really important for making sure that this little critter doesn't come in and eat all of our cottonwood trees. So the second forest type that I want to talk about is the one dominating low elevations, and this is lodgepole pine. So if you've been anywhere in Grand Teton, Yellowstone, or the broader area, I'm sure you're familiar with this tree. It's absolutely everywhere. And that's one of its strengths, because lodgepole pine can grow in many of the poor soil types that a lot of other trees can't grow. And so what that means is we have forest in areas where, if it wasn't for lodgepole pine, we might not have forest. So I'm very grateful to this tree personally. And similar as how the cottonwood stabilize soil for the rivers, these lodgepole pines also stabilize soil on the lake shores and on the toe slopes of the mountains, which again can prevent flash floods and erosion. So on the wildlife side, this was actually really fun for me to learn about because I'm usually so involved in the trees. I didn't know that much about what wildlife liked lodgepole pine. But what I've learned is that these trees are actually really important for animals who are foraging in the sagebrush, because the sagebrush often is right up against the lodgepole pine. And so animals are able to retreat into these forests for cover. And in addition to that, we have all kinds of birds that are specially adapted to eat lodgepole pine seeds, like the red crossbills. They have these little scissor-like bills that allow them to open up the cones and get right into those seeds. So again, a very important widespread forest type for many of the wildlife here in the park. The primary threats that I wanted to mention for lodgepole pine include bark beetles, which are the insects that basically go in and girdle a tree. They don't eat the leaves, they eat the right underneath the bark. Luckily, we haven't had too much of an issue in this area with these bark beetles for lodgepole pine yet, knock on wood, for now. And so the biggest threat that we think of to lodgepole pine is fire. And you'll notice that I have an asterisk here, and that's for an important reason, because we often like to think of fire as a highly destructive process, right? I'm telling you that it's a threat to these forests. But in reality, fire is a really important ecological process that helps these forests to regenerate. And so in these figures here, you can kind of see, here's the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and this zoomed in area shows Grand Teton National Park, with the yellow areas those are the different fires that have burned over the past few decades. And what you'll see is, first off, many of those fires have kind of burned here in what would be a lodgepole pine forest. And second off, these fires are happening in kind of a patchy mosaic pattern across the landscape. So what that means is that we have areas of young forest, areas of old forest, and areas in between, all kind of mixed together. And those different ages of forests helped by fire is what creates the diversity on the landscape to help all of the different wildlife species that we care about here in the park. So even though fire is the #1 thing that kills lodgepole pine trees, I actually don't know that I want to call it a threat today. So I like fire today. So the third forest type that I wanted to talk about is the one that happens at around middle elevations. And these broadly can be categorized as mixed conifer forests. They have Douglas fir, spruce, mostly Engelmann spruce, and subalpine fir, all mixed together. And these are the forests that you might encounter as you're hiking higher into the mountains. So kind of along this theme of as a forest being important for preventing erosion, these forests are particularly important for preventing erosions on hill slopes, because these are the ones that are mostly growing on the mountainside. And so if a big rain happens or an avalanche comes and clears things, these forests are really important to keep that hill slope intact rather than falling down the mountain and creating a large mudslide. These are also really important forests for carbon storage, which we know carbon is an important element of our climate system. And because the temperatures are a little bit cooler up at these middle elevations, decomposition is really slow and tree growth is really slow. So what that means is even after a tree dies and it falls over, that log can remain on the ground for sometimes decades, if not hundreds of years. And that carbon storage is really important from both a climate perspective and also from the perspective of all the critters who like to forage in those logs, including grizzly bears looking for grubs. So on the wildlife side of things, as temperatures are warming throughout the season, wildlife tend to go up into the mountains to seek later blooming plants and berries at those higher elevations. And one that I think of in particular are the grizzly and black bears. So whenever I'm hiking in this area, kind of at middle elevations, I notice all of the huckleberries, and so do the bears. And the reason those huckleberries are even there is because of the understory microclimate that is provided by these forests. So without the trees overhead, we wouldn't have those huckleberries, and the bears would have to search a lot further for their favorite food. So the #1 threat, in addition to bark beetles, which again is not that big of a deal here in the park yet, that I wanted to mention for middle elevation forests is western spruce budworm. So some of you might have noticed this kind of red or orangish coloration on the mountainside. That is defoliation happening by this little tiny caterpillar on the trees, western spruce budworm. This is actually the most damaging insect in Wyoming currently, but luckily it takes several years before it actually kills the tree. So most of the time, especially with these big trees, they might get the ends of their needles nibbled on by the caterpillars and then be fine the next year. So what we're hoping is that, this year is it's a fairly decent year for these western spruce budworm. But if we have a nice wet year next year, maybe they'll back off a little bit and the trees will be okay. So keep your eye out for these little guys. If you're outside hiking, they love to drop down on you on a little thing of silk, and that's who it is. So the final forest type, and perhaps my favorite if I had to choose, are those growing at the highest elevations up in the subalpine and alpine zone. So these are dominated by whitebark pine. They're often mixed in with those spruce and fir as well, but whitebark pine is the one that makes it all happen at these higher elevations. And that's because this tree is able to go in where no other plant can grow into those rocky, recently glaciated soils that don't have a whole lot of organic matter or other nutrients. And these trees make it work. They're able to deal with that. And so as soon as those trees come in and colonize the area, it allows other plants and other trees to grow as well. So once that starts happening and we get little clusters of trees here and there up way at 10,000 feet, those clusters of trees are critically important for retaining the snowpack because they're shading the snow and preventing it from melting as quickly. And by preventing snowpack from melting as quickly, that is providing a water source, not only to those trees and those forests up high, but to everybody downstream, both the plants and the wildlife in this mountain range for the entire season. In terms of habitat, you may have heard of the Clark's nutcracker, which is the bird who has a mutualism with the whitebark pine tree. The whitebark pine needs to be distributed by the Clark's nutcracker. So if you're up at these high elevations, you're going to hear a lot of these nutcrackers. But there's also all different kinds of animals up there. And this was something that really surprised me when I started working in higher elevations. I didn't expect to see a grizzly bear at 10,000 feet elevation. But it turns out these whitebark pine seeds are incredibly nutritious and have a huge amount of energy. So of course, later in the season, as these seeds are ripening and it's getting hotter at lower elevations, the grizzly bears just love to go up and eat these whitebark pine seeds, in addition to the red squirrels and marmots as well. So the threats for the whitebark pine forests are pretty severe. They're the most severe that we're going to talk about today. And so severe, in fact, that this tree has been listed as threatened by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the reason for that is these two players acting in tandem to kill between 50 and 90% of whitebark pine in this area, depending on what watershed you're looking at. So it has been a very noticeable decline for this species. So first of all, we have the white pine blister rust, which you can see here. It's like little orange tongues coming off of the tree. This is an invasive pathogen that was introduced from Eurasia and has been just decimating different species of five-needle pines like whitebark pine throughout the United States. And what this pathogen does is it mostly weakens the tree. It can kill the tree directly, of course, but what we are really seeing more and more is that it's weakening the tree and allowing it to be more susceptible to the native bark beetle, mountain pine beetle. So it's this synergy between an invasive pathogen and a native bark beetle that is causing this vast decimation of the whitebark pine trees. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the later sections as well. So I want to turn it over to Tucker, who's going to introduce you to the plot network we are installing to begin addressing some of these forest threats.
Thank you. So Grand Teton Forest Dynamics Plot Network. So this is a network of longitudinal permanent plots
that we're establishing. The purpose of this is to study the forest, Grand Teton, and the surrounding landscapes, and to provide a longitudinal monitoring baseline that will to be a baseline from which we can measure and study and monitor future changes. So we're all probably very familiar with hypothesis-driven experimental research. This is the type of science that you think of in grade school books, where you have a hypothesis, you design a study, you have a control and a treatment, you run some fancy stats, you get an answer. There's a lot of great science that's done that way. That's a little different from what we're doing here. It's different from a lot of ecology. It's hard to have a perfectly controlled study when we're studying organisms that live many hundreds of years, when we're studying forests that cannot fit in a research laboratory. So what we're doing here is observational science. We're using natural experiments, natural climate fluctuations that happen year to year, and through collecting a lot of data, making a lot of observations, we eventually amass a very large data set that can then be used. We still have hypotheses that we can still test, but it's more of a longitudinal observational approach to getting to understand these forests and these landscapes. Some of you may get a kick out of the comment. You can read it. We're doing the one on the right. Finally, a map of every tree. Hopefully we cleaned up a little bit better than that guy. So what we're doing in each of these plots. So we start by surveying a plot grid with a high accuracy GPS. So we're putting in a 20 by 20 meter temporary grid. We use each of those corners to then map all of the trees from. So you can see that's a fancy ultrasonic tree positioning device that helps us map trees when there's foliage in the way. So we're developing the stem map of all of the trees. We then measure the diameter of each tree and identify it, identify its species, put a tag in it so that we can track it, make sure that we're revisiting the same trees and tracking the data record associated with each tree. We can keep track of that individual tree through the years. We're tagging all stems greater than 1 centimeter diameter at breast height, forestry convention. We're talking about things that you would not necessarily think of as trees, saplings, anything about this tall will have a tag, and we'll be monitoring its growth and mortality in the future. We're additionally monitoring all five-needle pine, so that's both whitebark and limber pine. So all of the seedlings of five-needle pines, we're also tagging and monitoring their early life stages, because that allows us to capture some of the seedling to sapling transitions, which may be a critical population bottleneck. So we have a full population census of the five-needle pines. So every 5 years, we'll return, remeasure tree diameter. This will allow us to calculate growth rates. We can look at how tree neighborhoods and microsite factors are mediating tree growth. That'll allow us to calculate productivity, things like that. We're also returning every year to diagnose tree death. So when a tree dies, we want to know, a big part of our research program is trying to figure out what's killing trees. So when trees are alive, we're taking notes on their condition. Do they have evidence of defoliation? Do they have evidence of fungus? But when they die, then we do a really thorough pathology exam. We strip off the bark, not everywhere, but we'll look beneath the bark to look at the most recently live cambium, look for evidence of pathogens, look for evidence of bark beetles or other factors associated with death. So we'll do this for every new tree in each of these plots that dies in a given year. For all of these dead trees, we're also then taking a tree core just in the dead trees, which allows us to also look at growth rates, its antecedent growth rates that may have predisposed it to mortality, and that'll allow us to look back in time at the life history of that tree. So, crown jewel of the Grand Teton Forest Dynamics Plot Network is the Bradley Lake Big Plot. So it's a large permanent forest monitoring plot. It's on the north shore of Bradley Lake. Let's see. So lake edge here. So each of these dots is a mapped tree. Believe it or not, there are 28,000 dots on that map. This is a big plot. It's 25 hectares. It's about 60 acres in size. It's 500 meters by 500 meters on each side. And if you were just walking on the trail, when we just first walked that trail, we may have thought that this would have been a relatively homogeneous mixed conifer, kind of mid-elevation, your classic mid-elevation Douglas fir, mixed conifer forest. And indeed it is, but even just in looking at the stem map, we can see all of this heterogeneity in species composition, having to do with distance to the lake edge and microsite variability, really small differences in terrain that give rise to different forest composition. So this is one of the advantages of this big plot approach. If we had just one small plot, we might incorrectly characterize that part of the landscape as, well, as this forest type, Douglas fir, or maybe down here would have been spruce fir. But by having the big plot, we can look at these gradients in forest types and really get a deeper understanding of the forest that's there. One of the cool things that we're seeing is all of these bright green dots are all 5-needle pine seedlings. This is not there are very, very few mature 5-needle pines here. We would not have thought of this as a suitable habitat, but and it's likely not within these seedlings will likely not develop into mature trees. We don't see many mature trees, but there's apparently an abundance of regeneration there. So that's just one of these little snippets that is something we're going to be looking into further. Just a surprising thing that's already started to come out of this.
What other trees or 5-needle pines besides the limber pine?
Whitebark. So we've got in this area we have limber pine and whitebark pine.
That'd be whitebark there that you're showing.
Yeah.
Yes.
I see a hand back there too.
When did you? How long ago?
So this is finished as of this summer. So we started work last June 2024, and yeah, this map is new as of last month.
So is there a tag on every tree?
There's a tag on every tree.
Wow.
Our grad students are very patient.
And very hardworking. So here's another one. So the Bradley Lake Big Plot is going to be a great way to study our mid-elevation forests, which are broadly representative of the mid-elevations of Grand Teton and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But we're missing out on the whitebark, right? And for conservation reasons, we obviously care a ton about the whitebark. For aesthetic and recreation reasons, whitebark are a super important tree individually, and whitebark forests are a super important forest type. The logistics of putting in a large plot in whitebark are significant. So we've ended up with a much smaller plot up in the whitebark. So this is a 4-hectare plot. We did 1 hectare last summer, so 100 meters by 100 meters, relatively large in size, depending on the type of science that you're used to, relatively small for forest tomography plots. And we're expanding it to 4 hectares this summer. You can see there's a lot of open area in there. So it's much less than 4 hectares of trees, but having it be 4 hectares in size allows us to get enough patches that we can start to study those patch dynamics with having multiple patches of whitebark. So this is a predominantly whitebark pine forest. There's also spruce and fir in there. Also a surprising number of seedlings. Way more seedlings than we anticipated up there, which was really encouraging. In contrast to some of the whitebark pine forests that we've seen that have been decimated, this stand is doing okay currently. There has been a lot of mortality. There's a lot of active mortality right now, but there's also a lot of live whitebark left, which is that's important for us when establishing the spot. That way our goal is studying how these trees are dying, when they're dying, why they're dying, and that mission, it's important to have some live trees.
Are you putting pheromones on the trees up there?
We are not, but the park is,
'Cause that tree had like 4 packages on it, like 3 days ago.
that tree.
That specific tree.
Huh, interesting. Good to know. Yeah, I think there's some folks here that know something about that, but yeah, so we've been coordinating with them. We'd love to do some work to be able to study the efficacy of different pheromone patch, different numbers of patches, and things like that. Help figure out what's the best way to use the pheromone patches to protect these big trees. So that's high elevation whitebark, a tree line forest. Whitebark also exists in more of a mixed conifer forest at lower elevations. So we have a 1 hectare site of Cascade, South Fork of Cascade Canyon. This is it's almost closed canopy. More of a whitebark is co-dominant with spruce there. There's some fir as well, but the biggest trees are spruce and whitebark. And so this is a really important complement to the paintbrush site. It will allow us to study whitebark at the lower end of its limit. It occurs down lower, but this is the lower elevational extent where it can be really happy and it can really thrive and still get quite large and old. One of these other satellite plots, so that this map on the left, so we've got the Bradley Lake big plot, and then these are the other satellite plots that are in the process of getting installed. Not going to go through all of them, but this is the last one I'll talk about because it's our very own AMK ranch plot in the lodgepole pine forest just north of us. This is another 1 hectare satellite plot in the lodgepole pine, which, as Sarah mentioned, is super widespread forest type. So it's really important for us to have a satellite plot in this forest type, which is so broadly represented across the GYE. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah. We'll start talking about what type of research we're doing using these data.
If anyone's interested in looking at the AMK plot, it is about a 3-minute walk from here. Please help me, Casey. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. My apologies. And so part of the reason, in addition to capturing some lodgepole pine, which is so important, we also wanted a plot that was more accessible to folks who don't necessarily want to hike up 10 miles to Paintbrush Canyon to see what we're doing up there. And so if you want to look at what our tags look like or just kind of get a feeling for the type of science we do, we're going to be here every year remeasuring these trees. And so get in touch with us and we're more than happy to go out there and show you what we're doing. So kind of moving on to some snapshots. Really, the goal of this section is to give a very broad overview of the forest research that Tucker and my labs are currently working on. So we're not going to be going into a ton of detail for any one of these studies, but what I do want this section to be is a testament to all of the different ways that one might go about studying a forest and really how important it is to consider each different scale of forest organization when you're doing so. So this is going to be organized in terms of the scale that we're talking about. So if you're ever wondering, oh man, what are they talking about now? Just look right down here and we'll either be talking about tree cells, trees, stands, all the way up to regions and global forests. So we're gonna cover a lot of ground in this final section. To start off, I want to share some research that my PhD student Jared Friedman is working on right now up in the whitebark pine zone to more or less figure out why are some trees dying while others survive. Because even if there is 90% mortality in these forests, that means there is something special about those 10% of trees, and we need to figure out what it is. There's all kinds of studies that are showing us more and more that there can be some genetic precursors for why some trees survive and others don't. But what we're finding is it's not all about genetics. There are also some really important physiological attributes that these surviving trees have that we would only be able to learn about when looking at the cellular scale. So specifically what Jared is doing is he's taking tree cores And he's asking what tree rings can tell us about how these surviving trees or dying trees responded to extreme weather, white pine blister rust, and even each other over the course of their lives. So many of you might be familiar with this image on the left of just a standard tree core. So this is, every year trees put on rings of wood, shown here. And those rings might be larger or smaller depending on how happy the tree is, if it was a wet year or if there was lots of competition. But the thing is, the cells that make up those tree rings can also be larger or smaller depending on how happy the tree is. And that can actually tell us something even more. And so what you're looking at here are the very same tree rings, but now at a cellular level. So every little pink circle is a tree cell, and the pink part is the actual carbon that the tree is storing, and the empty parts are where the tree transports water. So if those cells are bigger, the tree can transport more water. And if those cells are thicker, so if there's more pink, that means we are sequestering more carbon. So by looking at the cellular level, we're not only kind of linking this back to why trees are feeling stressed, but also to these ecosystem level properties of carbon and water cycling. So to do this, we take a tree core of the dead trees here in the park. We slice them very thinly using a microtome, and then we dye them with various biological stains where the pink is accentuating the woody parts and blue or purple is accentuating non-woody parts. And then we use an AI algorithm to process those images with plenty of human eyes on there for quality control. And it basically tells us how big these cells are and how many there are and how they change over the width of an individual tree ring. So I want to share some really interesting preliminary results from the Shoshone National Forest that Jared will be building on here in the park. And so what we have found by looking at tree cells are a couple of really interesting things. So first, I want to point out that these blue lines are trees that survived the mountain pine beetle outbreak, whitebark pine trees that survived, and the red curve are trees that died. So what we see here, first off, is that trees that survived could transport more water than trees that died. And upon further analysis, what we found is that's because they were actually making bigger cells, and they were specifically doing that during summers that it was hotter and drier. So these trees that were surviving the mountain pine beetle are also the trees that are more resilient to a warming subalpine climate. This is really good news. And so because they were making larger cells, especially in those hotter summers, they were able to transport more water. And we especially saw this during years where there was high snowpack. So if there was a high snowpack, the trees that ultimately survived were able to use it because they had cells big enough. Whereas the trees that died, they weren't really able to use that snowpack. And ultimately that caused their decline. So the second thing we found by looking at these cells is this blue line here showing us way higher carbon storage for the trees that survived mountain pine beetle. So in addition to the fact that we like carbon storage for climate regulation reasons, this also indicates how stressed the tree was. If a tree is photosynthesizing and storing a lot of carbon, that means it's doing well. It's pretty happy. And so overall, because these trees were making big cells, transporting lots of water, able to do lots of photosynthesis and store a lot of carbon, they were ready when the bark beetles came to resist those bark beetles. And that's exactly what happened. So this is something that the cellular scale was able to tell us that simply looking at the tree rings themselves, we wouldn't have known. So Jared will be building on this work here in the park to tell us, is this still true for the forest of Grand Teton rather than just in the Shoshone?
So scaling up to the tree scale. So I'm going to be talking about some of my work that my PhD student, Edward Chapman, is leading. So he is looking into how do trees respond to short-term climate and weather fluctuations. In tree rings, we're seeing how trees are responding each year or over a set of years. But what we're looking at here is how does a hot week influence tree growth? Or what about a hot few weeks? How about a wet spring versus a dry spring? So these within season fluctuations in temperature and precipitation, how is that impacting tree physiology and tree growth? He's also looking at how tree neighbors and microsites, convexities and concavities, dense neighborhoods, open neighborhoods, how those factors mediate tree growth, and how different species are responding differently to those climate drivers and those microsite factors. So the way that we're doing this, so we're using what are called point dendrometers. These are little devices that we install on the tree, and they have a little sensor that rests on it rests on the bark, and it picks up shrink and swell in the xylem as the tree grows, as it picks up water and as it transpires and shrinks a little bit, and then we can see the growth signal over the course of weeks or months. So we see this is what the data look like. We've got these daily diurnal fluctuations where tree takes up water during the night, and then it starts photosynthesizing, and it photosynthesizes during the day, and it transpires all of that water away, so it actually shrinks a little bit during the day. But what we see over the course of multiple days, we see that the curve eventually does go up, right? It's storing carbon. The tree is eventually getting bigger as it packs on the carbon, as the rings get wider. So what we're seeing in this signal, we're seeing productivity, we're seeing carbon storage, but we're also seeing drought severity and hydraulic functioning of the tree. Its water status. Is it well hydrated or not? So some preliminary results that Edward has from, this is actually from a different forest, but it's a nice figure, so I wanted to share it here. So we have the green line is an average among trees in really open neighborhoods. The orange line is an average among trees in denser neighborhoods. And we see those lines are not the same. Trees in more open neighborhoods are growing faster than trees in denser neighborhoods. It's perhaps not that surprising. There's a limited amount of resources, so we might expect that. But that might be true for a light limited forest where competition for light is limiting growth. What about in a water limited forest like we have here in the Central Rockies? We might expect to see the same thing, where competition for water gives rise to a similar pattern where dense neighborhoods, trees grow at a slower rate than more open neighborhoods. But we could also imagine reasons that wouldn't be the case. For example, denser neighborhoods might occur on wetter sites that are more permissible for tree growth anyways. So we might see overall, all trees are happier because it's a wetter site and that site happens to be denser. So stay tuned for results there. Some of the implications of this work. So these point dendrometers will be providing high accuracy measurements of tree growth and tree hydraulics. This will allow us to monitor and model how different species are responding to really fine scale climate fluctuations. And this will have implications for how future forest composition as climate shifts. We might, if one species does a lot better with increasingly hot and dry summers, we might expect to see a shift in composition towards that species. So this will help us develop a more mechanistic understanding of composition shifts that we can also, that we can test empirically. So this can also be combined with remote sensing to scale up to the standard landscape to make, to make these. I think I'll save that point for later. We're scaling up. We'll get there. On to the stand scale.
Yeah, I love that you gave that little teaser for the landscape scale there, but not yet. We're going to stop at the stand scale first to talk about my master's student Kelly Goodwin's work. So we're going back to the whitebark pine zone here for Kelly's work. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk today, whitebark pine is a really important species for colonizing these really harsh high elevation sites. And once they start growing there, they facilitate all these other plants and trees that are able to come into those newly developed soils, kind of in the protected shade and wind protection of these whitebark pine trees. So we know that whitebark pine facilitates other plant species. Knowing that, what does it mean that so many of them are dying? Does it mean that because they facilitated these plants, those plants are there now and they're fine? Or is the whitebark pine mortality going to have an impact on the plant and microorganism species in that ecosystem? So that's exactly what Kelly is studying up at these high elevation forests. So what she did was she measured understory plant communities under 60 dead trees and 60 live trees, and technically also 60 dying trees, but I won't talk about those today. It's a little too complicated. And she measured under each of these trees what the plant cover was, and she identified every single understory plant to species to look at how diverse these understory communities were as well. So you can kind of start seeing the hint of the results here, where underneath these dead trees, it was a little more sparse, and underneath the live trees, we have a richer understory plant community. Now, this was controlling for microsite differences. So she sampled both dead and live whitebark pine on rocky habitats, soil habitats, wet sites, dry sites, all across the gamut, so that we were making sure that it wasn't one of those microsite characteristics that was actually influencing our results. And what she found was, after controlling for those microsite differences, there was indeed lower understory plant cover underneath the dead whitebark pine trees. And I was actually really surprised by this, because a lot of these plants are perennials, and I wouldn't necessarily expect for them to have such a rapid response. You know, we're talking in the last decade or so to these whitebark pines dying. But indeed, that's what we found. And part of what we're beginning to think this might implicate is that whitebark pine is not only helping those understory plants establish, but it might also be helping them survive. And this makes sense. You know, up at the high elevations, there are a lot of stressful factors. There is blowing ice on harsh winds. There are deep snowpacks. There are cold temperatures and strong ultraviolet rays. And having a canopy tree over you might really help as a little plant to survive some of those harsh conditions. So the next step for Kelly's work is to do this exact same study, but look underground now. So what she just did a couple weeks ago was went out and she put little sandbags about this big underneath those 60 dead trees and 60 live trees, and also some kind of out where they're in a random pattern where there aren't any trees at all, to measure mycorrhizal fungi, which are those fungal species that help trees and plants acquire nutrients. Because one thing that we're trying to figure out is why we're seeing this pattern of lower plant cover underneath dead trees. One possibility is that when the whitebark pines die, their fungal friends die with them. And as a consequence, that has, you know, implications for the understory plant communities as well. So I'm excited to share those results with you all, hopefully next year.
Big landscapes. We've got some big landscapes. It's very difficult to sample them with field data alone. So one of the really important ways that we're able to study and monitor change at landscape scales is remote sensing, satellite-based imagery, where we can look at spectral response and spectral change. We've probably all seen examples of this with maps of fire severity. You see maps of fire extent, fire perimeters, and we have the nice red to green spectrum indicating fire severity. So all done with remote sensing. We also have another example of this would be maps of biomass and carbon storage, these wall-to-wall maps that provide an estimate of how much vegetation, how much biomass is on any pixel on the landscape. So these are incredibly powerful tools, but what we often forget is field validation is essential for this. And field-based forest inventories are the basis for any maps of vegetation characteristics. Field-based measurements of fire severity are used to calibrate fire severity maps. So field data, despite high-resolution satellite imagery and the availability of that, field data remain a really essential part of making those making those remotely derived data sets actually intelligible and making them actually useful. But despite the importance of field data, they're actually quite rare. Large field data sets are difficult to install, and longitudinal data sets are exceptionally rare. Often a field data set will be installed for a few years and then the study is complete, and we don't develop this longitudinal data stream that can be used in perpetuity to calibrate against remote sensing data. So this longitudinal data set would be really important for calibrating fire severity maps, should there ever be a fire in any of these plots, and as well as products like maps of biomass and carbon storage. So another way that we're scaling to the landscape scale is using process-based forest landscape models. So this is essentially, you can imagine you take a large landscape and you take that imagery, and the imagery is made up of a whole bunch of different pixels. So what a forest landscape model does is it applies a mechanistic understanding of tree growth and mortality and regeneration, things like that, these ecological processes that we can model. And it models that for each pixel on the landscape. And we can also overlay that with spatially explicit disturbance processes like fire. So we can, these run in conjunction with fire models or dispersal models that show how a species can disperse from one pixel to an adjacent pixel. So these are really a way to get, to allow us to simulate what a landscape looks like now. And we can basically press play and simulate what that landscape might look like in the future under different climate scenarios, different management scenarios, different possible future wildfire scenarios, things like that. So my postdoc, Tyler Mitchell, is working on this currently, developing a Landis model. Landis is just the modeling platform for well, it's one example of a forest landscape model that we're using. So Tyler's using this to simulate different wildfire land use, land management scenarios to develop future projections of future landscape conditions and vegetation change in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And the reason that it's part of this talk is these field data that are part of that we're collecting in the Grand Teton Forest Dynamics plots will be used to both parameterize and set up this model, and also to validate it and make sure that our future projections are credible. We'll have the data to actually compare it against.
So this one will be kind of brief, but I just wanted to introduce you all to a program that Tucker and I have initiated at the University of Wyoming, which is the Wyoming Forest Resilience Institute. There's not a whole lot of forestry at the university, and so it's really important for us to band together and support the 17% of land in Wyoming that is forested. And so at the state level, we are doing several things, including integrating these field data and landscape models to help managers to kind of ask this fundamental question of what are the greatest risks to Wyoming forests, and how can our research and others' research help managers to mitigate those risks. So the landscape models and projections of future forests based on different management scenarios are a really important tool that our research kind of can culminate together to help managers figure out what scenario might work best for a certain forest type. So I wanted to point out here that even though there aren't very many forests in Wyoming compared to, say, Idaho or Washington State, our forests do have tremendous ecosystem services like we've talked about earlier today, and they also have among the highest fire risk. So when fire burns in Wyoming, you can see here on the left, it tends to burn in the forested areas. Yes, there are grassland fires and sagebrush fires, absolutely. But the highest severity fires, the worst ones and the biggest ones, tend to be in forests. And as of 2000, we've seen 15% of our forest burned and almost 30% of our forest killed by mountain pine beetle alone. So that's the bark beetle that's killing whitebark pine, but it also kills a bunch of other pine species. And so you can see in this image on the right, All of the colored portions are the forests that have died back as a consequence of mountain pine beetle in the state. So part of this regional scale research that we're doing, integrating the Grand Teton plots and even expanding out of that, is to try to figure out these two main threats to Wyoming forests. And what a message that I want to leave you with is that the greatest risk to these forests is not the disturbance itself. It's not the fire. It's not the mountain pine beetle itself, but it's the inability of those forests to recover after a disturbance. Forests are used to fire. They adapted with fire. They adapted with mountain pine beetle. It's a native insect. But if the forests are not regenerating for some reason, maybe it's too hot, maybe there's habitat fragmentation, then that's what's going to really be the biggest threat to our forests. And so part of what we're doing is measuring forest recovery after fire. So in the unfortunate, perhaps, event that one of our fully mapped and tagged plots burns, which it might, we've worked in those plots before in other parts of the country, and these do burn sometimes. But the benefit of that is that we'll have this amazing pre-fire data set to really help us understand why the fire burned like it did. And then we can go in afterwards and figure out how are the forests recovering. So in this image, you can see this sea of very happy seedlings coming in after a fire. And the question that we are asking is, this is great, but how do these young trees and all of these dead trees increase the risk of another wildfire, right? So even though regeneration looks good now, if we keep having fire after fire after fire, those forests might not be looking as good anymore. So the Grand Teton data are really important kind of pre-fire baselines for us to compare these types of post-fire conditions to. And then the second one related to this mountain pine beetle figure that I showed that I wanted to mention is Trevor Bloom's work comparing whether natural or planted whitebark pine seedlings survive better after these whitebark pine forests have been decimated by mountain pine beetle. So what he's doing in several of our plots is planting a bunch of white pine blister rust resistant whitebark pine seedlings. And because we have a full map of all of the natural regeneration for these trees, we're able to compare whether those naturally regenerating trees do better or worse than the ones that are planted and rust resistant. So that's something that Trevor is leading right now in a couple of our plots, and we're hoping to expand that as well to the state level.
The globe is big. This is not just us studying global forests, obviously, but what we're doing here might be unique in some ways. We are not the first ones who had the crazy idea to map a bunch of trees. This is actually part of a global network. So the Grand Teton Forest Dynamics plot is part of the Smithsonian Forest Global Earth Observatory, the ForestGEO program. So this is actually a global network spanning 84 different sites. We will probably be the 85th. 29 countries, over 7 million trees, over 10,000 species. One pretty cool thing that I want to point out, you might notice, so that's the Grand Teton Forest Dynamics plot. It's the only plot in the Rockies. The Rocky Mountains have a lot of forests. Our forests are unique. They're not quite like the Sierras. They're also obviously quite not like forests of the Eastern Seaboard. So the forests of the Rocky Mountains were really underrepresented in this global network. And so we're really honored and thrilled to be bringing a plot to the network. So the mission of ForestGEO it's a network of scientists and forest research sites dedicated to advancing the long-term study of the world's forests with the mission of improving our capacity in an era of rapidly changing landscapes and climate, improving our capacity to understand and predict future forest dynamics. So what that can look like. So we're zooming, this is on a global scale. We're not talking so much about place-based research. We're thinking about forests really broadly, thinking about forests globally. So many of these questions can be addressed through international collaborations that ask fundamental questions related to how forests assemble and how they function. This can look like comparing forest structure across different regions, comparing temperate forests here to temperate forests in similarly climatically similar regions in Europe, comparing forests across really broad climate gradients, monitoring forest health and forest change, again, globally, so forests are a globally important carbon sink, and ForestGEO provides these high quality data sets to calculate and monitor forest biomass and carbon dynamics. One of the things that's come out of the ForestGEO network is a study that I was involved with, looking at the ecological importance of big trees to forest carbon storage. And we found that the 1% of biggest trees, so we're talking if you have 100 trees and you take one single biggest one, that's what our definition of big trees in this paper. Those big trees, the 1% of trees, had half of forest carbon storage. So ecologically, super important. Those big trees are numerically rare, but really contribute disproportionately to forest carbon storage. So that has implications when we think about mortality of big trees. You can look at a forest and maybe you only have 1 or 2% mortality. It doesn't look like much of the forest is dying, but if it's those big trees that are dying, that has a really enormous impact on the capacity of that forest to store carbon. Forests also store 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. So a lot of what the people in the network are looking at is patterns and drivers in biodiversity and how biodiversity relates to forest health and how all of that is changing. So with that, we're going to loop back around. So forests, they're a multi-scale ecological phenomena. And we hope to have given you a picture and made this point that it is really through studying forests and thinking about forests across all of these different scales. Subtree, looking at cells and rings, all the way up to trees, stands, landscapes. It is through connecting studies across all of those different scales that's critical to help us understand how forests are functioning. Sara's going to give key takeaways.
So I know we just hit you with a ton of information. And so I wanted to just sum this up as 3 key takeaways, if you remember anything from our talk today. And the first is that Grand Teton has some really amazing forests. And those forests are distinct, kind of following the elevational bands as you go up the mountain from the Snake River Basin all the way up to the Alpine Zone. And each of those forest types serves a really critical and unique role, both for the ecosystem and for the wildlife of the park. The second key takeaway is that we are doing a lot of really big things to study those forests because of how important they are. So the Grand Teton Forest Dynamics Plot Network is all of these mapped trees that we are going to be revisiting year after year. It integrates with the Wyoming Forest Resilience Institute to help us help managers to provide research and evidence-based science for management decisions. And finally, it integrates with this global Smithsonian ForestGEO program to ask fundamental questions about forests and help track how forests are changing at the global scale. And finally, from the science perspective, what we're finding is that forest health is at risk here in the Rockies. It is. But every tree is different. Every species is different. And because of those differences, these forests actually do have a tremendous capacity to recover following great die-off events like the mountain pine beetle epidemics and wildfire. So I have hope and optimism for our forests, and it's just tremendous watching how resilient they actually are in the face of change. So with that, I wanted to take just one final moment to thank all of our amazing partners, many of whom here at the park. I have been just outstanded by the way that Grand Teton National Park supports science and has been supportive of our long-term research program being established here. So we are deeply grateful for all of the personnel here at the park who have supported us in this endeavor so far. I wanted to specifically call out Laura Jones, who we've been working very closely with to pick some of these specific sites, and she's just been a joy to work with and a wealth of knowledge. I also wanted to list all of these students, mentees, postdocs, and technicians who have been the amazingly patient and strong labor behind these tree maps. Our students are doing amazing work, and the technicians have had such a great attitude putting in these tree maps. We are just so grateful to have been working with such wonderful mentees for this work. So with that, we are happy to take any questions with any remaining time that's left. Thank you so much for your time.